Podcast w głowie się mieści. Hello everyone, it's Wrap Your Head Around It podcast, and I have a big pleasure and honor to host today the Mr. Lars Madsen. Hello.
Hello, Adam. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. It's a great honor.
Yeah, it's a great honor for me and for my listeners. Like to have you. You are a specialist in schema therapy. You're a schema therapist, clinical psychologist. Yeah, and like you specialized in the treatment of the people with antisocial personality disorder. Like not only one, but like this is something that you are also known for. Yeah.
Yes. yes. I'm just for your audience. So I'm a advanced accredited schema therapist, clinical psychologist, forensic psychologist, and I've been working with forensic clients. I would say close to about 25 years now. I did my training in Australia, my clinical training to become a clinical psychologist, and then I did my PhD in England, where I worked within a forensic hospital and then within various forensic units as well, working with personality disorder mainly, antisocial personality disorder. So I started working I started becoming interested in schema therapy in the late 90s, early 2000s, because it was a new thing and I was really interested in it. It seemed to me at that time to make a lot of sense. But I became back interested in schema therapy when I was working in the UK, in England, specifically with very personality disordered men in this particular case, who had histories of violence and sexual violence. And schema therapy at that stage became sort of a way of trying to sort of work with these individuals who are very difficult to engage and sometimes also to understand. And at that stage, schema therapy kind of made a lot of sense to me. It allowed me to sort of make sense of these individuals and work with them in ways that I believed was effective. And I've continued that since I've come back to Australia. And now I work in a clinic in Brisbane. So I work a little bit in my clinic, and I also work within some institutions where I see men within the prison as well, working with them on the issues of violence and sexual violence and their problems that they have, being able to get along with other people in many cases. So that's what I do, and I'm also I'm a supervisor and trainer of other schema therapists doing similar kind of stuff as well. So I'm very happy to be here.
Very impressive. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think like the first thing that comes to my mind that wow, so it's not an easy work. Yeah, because like from my experience, I know that many of the therapists, they are like afraid of work with those with people with those kinds of personality problems. So like what motivates you to work with those clients with
Oh, what motivates you? Well, look, it's difficult. I think that probably along the way in my career, my motivation to work within this space has probably chopped and changed, as it probably does for most people. I think early on, when I became interested in working within a forensic context, I didn't really have any understanding of what it was like working within forensic environments. I wouldn't say that I thought about it like NCSI, the TV show, where, they're masterminding things like that. I can't say that I thought it was like that, but, I perhaps thought it was something similar. So I became interested in understanding these kinds of things. My first placement in a prison was really coincidental. I was arriving late for university student. All the other placements had been taken. There was only one left, and that was in a prison, and so I had to take that, right? And after doing that placement there, they offered me a job to work as a counsellor in the prison for a period of time, and that's really where it kind of started. So I kind of started there, and then along the way, the supervisor that I had in the prison, he went on to work in the university, and then he sort of invited me to come along and do research, to be to be a project manager for his research project, also within forensics, and I did that for a period of time. So, and then in the context of I had completed at that stage my clinical school as a clinical psychologist, and I was working as a project manager at a university in a criminology department, and then I on a whim, you can say, on the spur of the moment, I was reading this journal article written by this other academic in the UK, and I just emailed him and said, spontaneously one day, saying, "Hey, I'd be interested in coming to do a PhD in the UK. Is this possible?" And lo and behold, it was possible, and I ended up in the UK doing more research in forensics, and also working as a forensic clinical psychologist in a forensic hospital. So that's kind of where it started. To answer the question, what motivates you? I mean, I think what I probably have enjoyed over time is I like the puzzle of figuring stuff out. I think and sometimes working with individuals who can on the face of it seem quite extreme, and to have time to be able to sort of make sense of what's going on, and to try to work with that person and also the institution to alleviate their distress, to help them manage things in a better way, I think I find really satisfying. And I think also I find really satisfying being able to sort of sometimes, certainly within a forensic space, within you hear horrible things, and you see horrible things in many cases as well. And my job at different times in my career has been to try to help understand what's happened in these situations, and be able to explain it to the institution, or to various other kinds of committees and settings, and to make sense of it. And by making sense of it, then being able to try to figure out, well, how do we make this different, or what do we do about this kind of thing? So I found that very gratifying, and I think that discovering schema therapy, particularly working forensic schema therapy, which is slightly different to clinical schema therapy, I think. I think that also is a model that, to me, just makes implicit sense in terms of working with individuals who appear, like you said, quite scary and difficult to understand. I think for me, once I understand the model, the mode model, and the overcompensating modes, and start to recognize what's going on, and how to recognize these different sides of people, then suddenly it becomes less scary. You start to see what's really going on in the room, and you start to also be able to kind of figure out what might help that person, or what helped the situation. So I find that that's quite quite satisfying as well.
Yeah, great. And what was for you like the most important lesson from working with those patients? Because I think that to know the key things from the forensic schema therapy is a one thing, but the other thing, I think that working with those patients, like our own modes and schemas, they can be in a big rush, when especially maybe on the beginning, when you start to work with those patients. So how do you deal with your own emotions, yeah, working with those patients, and what works for you, like maybe what are like a key differences between the forensic schema therapy and the clinical, like for
Yeah.
you?
Yeah. Okay. So so how do I deal with working with these kinds of environments? Well, give you a little some examples of the different roles that I've had at times. So one of my roles at times as a therapist was also to do evaluations of if they'd institutional violence situations. So if there'd been assault or murder or some kind of attack on another person within the prison, and they would remove the person, and part of my role and job was as to evaluate what had actually happened, and to see and to interview the perpetrator, the person who had been violent, to try to make sense of what was going on in this particular situation. So this would happen within institutions, and my role was to assess that, write up a report, and present it. So you're confronted a lot of the time to quite extreme. I was confronted. Not everyone does, but a lot of people working in this space would have. So you would be exposed to obviously extreme violence and sometimes images and scenes and smells and things like that, which can be quite traumatizing and visceral. And I think that at different times, early on in my career, I probably struggled to acknowledge the trauma and the stress of that kind of thing. And I think that I probably at different times would have had, symptoms of what would be, some kind of PTSD in relation to that. As I've gotten older and become, I think, more skilled as a therapist and had, been able to sort of understand, myself a little bit more. I think we all develop as therapists, as people we'd want to.
Habituate sometimes to those images.
Yeah. So I think understanding these things, I think you start to understand them differently. And I think the problems, one of the difficulties in forensic environments, in institutional environments, we often can, I think, they can develop a very stoic, avoidant culture. So people almost have to deny the fact that they are vulnerable. They have to deny the fact that they have reactions to things. In fact, it's almost seen as if you have a reaction, it's seen as some kind of slight upon you. And early on, I think that I certainly perhaps bought into this mindset. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that it's really important to recognize and acknowledge these kinds of things. How I deal with the trauma of these kinds of really extreme behaviors, I think that I have a part of myself in terms of being very kind of very analytical in terms of how I approach things. So I've, I have a very good understanding, I think, of the assessment literature of making sense of these kinds of issues. And I found that I've leaned on that quite a bit in terms of, almost being quite scientific in terms of approaching problems and issues and trying to make sense of them without getting caught up in my own emotional reactions in it. And I think that that's probably helped me. I was at coroner's court not very long ago, where a coroner's court is a process that we have in Australia. You'd have it, I imagine, in Poland as well, and it probably called something different, whether there's been a death in custody or something like that. And in this particular case, I was called to coroner's court because one of my patients who I'd assessed in the institution had gone on and murdered someone, and they were sort of wanting to sort of ask me questions about obviously what had happened here and what I thought about this individual. And I found that process was a really, it's quite a confronting process, of course, but I found that what helped me stay anchored was really that my knowledge, I think, of the assessment process that I'd gone through with this person, and being confident that I'd done that competently, almost, or to the best of my ability. At the same time, accepting that, we have flaws and we have limitations to our knowledge and our understanding of things, and that's part of this space, that we can't always get it right, and trying to be perfect is unrealistic. So I think those kinds of things kind of help me in one level. In terms of my own sort of psychological well-being and health, I think that through the years you need to be able to have some different variety. I think if you work exclusively with psychopathic and antisocial individuals over a long, long time, it does weigh you down, because they are very, very demanding clients. They can be very challenging to you. And it's really difficult to sometimes be able to be confident about your judgment of them. There's literature, and this is interesting to comment on, that the more time you spend with a psychopathic patient or client, the less psychopathic you think that they actually are. And when they try to make sense of what this finding means, then one of the ways that they do that is that psychopathic clients who are very, very good at being manipulative and very good at being charming and so on, become very good at reading you as a person and also ingratiating themselves with you and manipulating you. So over the years, I've realized that it's important that I have other things other than working just in this space, and other clients that I work with. So I do training, which I enjoy doing. I also do a podcast focused just on forensic schema therapy, which I enjoy doing. It's just been a recent thing.
Where we can find your podcast. So maybe it will be good for our audience to listen.
Absolutely. My podcast is called Beyond the Crime, the Psychological Analysis, and I do it with Shay Addison and Robert Brockman as well. So we do it like once a month and have a forensic schema focus for each episode, usually around some topic or some area. Do it. So I do things like that, and I try to you need, and I try to kind of recognize that my own that it's okay for me to be vulnerable, and my vulnerable child, if we can use it. You're a schema therapy podcast. We can use this. Sometimes you have to make sure that you protect your vulnerable child in this space, and that sometimes means you kind of perhaps in my own mind, for instance, will put him away in particular kinds of environments, so that the harm, the emotional harm or exploitation that you might experience in these environments is minimized.
Yeah, and I can imagine that those patients, does they want to be like treated? What's their motivation to work with a therapist? Because I think that that it could be one of the most challenging things, that I think that those are patients, they don't want to be treated. Yeah, am I right, or is it a myth?
No. Look, in these spaces, a lot of the time when you work in forensic spaces, you're working with people, many people who have significant trauma histories. So they all, in my experience, very few clients that I've worked with over the longer term who would fit into these categories have ever had a childhood where their needs were met and where they were safe and where they felt cared about, loved and nurtured. So many of them have significant trauma histories. And I think a portion of them within this space really do want help. Like sometimes, times when they come in touch with the criminal justice system, and it's the first time that they sometimes have psychologists or counselors or social workers sitting down and asking them about these things and listening to them and trying to help them. And I think that kind of can feel quite good for them. But of course, the kind of therapy that, and this is going back to the difference perhaps between a clinical forensic context and a forensic schema therapy context, is that within a clinical context, a client will usually come along voluntarily. They will talk about a problem in their life. And then eventually through the process of your assessment, you will be able to identify, well, this kind of fits a theme or a pattern that goes all the way back to their childhood. And then we can kind of conceptualize it within a schema model and then work to try to help them overcome, whatever that problem might be. In forensic schema therapy, a lot of the time, what we get asked to do is this person has got these problems with violence, and they've got these problems of doing whatever that they're doing that gets them into trouble with the law, and they need help. They need some kind of treatment to deal with it. And often the people that end up coming to schema therapy, certainly with me, and I imagine with other folks who work with it, are usually the ones that are quite extreme. So they're quite extreme personality disorder presentations. They're very, very antisocial or borderline antisocial, and psychopathic, which is an extreme form of an antisocial personality disorder. So a lot of the time what you end up realizing is that these individuals, it's characteristics about their schema modes, right? Their overcompensating schema modes that in many cases are kind of implicated in their offending behavior or the repeat offending behavior. So what you have to try to do is you have to start to kind of and this is the beauty of schema therapy, schema mode therapy, that was obviously developed by David Bernstein and his colleagues in Holland in the 2000s. What you end up having to do is you're having to nuance and engage with these very difficult to engage characters who have very little trust, who are seeking to try to manipulate you, who are seeking to try to exploit you, to try to be able to get, something from you. You're having to sort of work with them and work with the overcompensating modes in a way that is meaningful. And I think because what you're trying to do, what your job and objective in this space is essentially to try to help them recognize the problems that they have with violence or whatever it might be, is in many cases often linked to overcompensating modes or angry child modes, and that the key is the therapy is eventually to try to help them build up the healthy adult mode, resolve as best as can be resolved some of the underlying trauma linked to the development of the schema, and obviously help them start to recognize when their overcompensating modes become too big and put them at risk of maybe lashing out at someone or hurting someone or stalking someone or doing something like that. So our objective in the forensic space is less about trying to heal the clinical problem, although that's important, and more about trying to reduce what we would call risk. And risk, in many cases, sits with the overcompensating modes. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and have you heard some other maybe myths, like about the probably like you heard about a lot of myths, but maybe what would be the most important for the therapist, who works with, or maybe they will work with patients with antisocial personality disorder?
Yeah, look, there's a few myths, or typical myths and stereotypes around some of these individuals. Like, firstly, I mean, when we talk about antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, often people confuse the two, right? So antisocial personality disorder is a diagnosis within the DSM-5. So the key traits of people with ASD is they have it's all in the definition, right? It's there's a disregard for the rights of others. It's problems, conduct problems that begin early in childhood and continue all the way to adulthood. And the kinds of behaviors that we're looking at that get evaluated is lying, impulsivity, aggression, irresponsibility, a lack of remorse for harming others, that kind of thing. ASPD, antisocial personality disorder within the DSM, focuses, though, a lot of the time, to get the diagnosis, is on observable behaviors and violations of social norms and laws, right? So it's very much what the name says. It's like, if you go around breaking the laws all the time and you do it all the time, then that's pretty antisocial. So antisocial personality disorder. Psychopathy is different. So psychopathy is not a formal diagnosis within the DSM. it's actually considered a much more severe form of antisocial personality disorder. So psychopathy will includes all the behaviors of antisocial personality disorder, but it also includes specific personality traits that you might see. So psychopathic personality traits might include something like superficial charm, a tendency to be quite glib and charismatic, a proneness to being very good at being able to manipulate people, a lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and a grandiose sense of self-worth, right? So if you think psychopathy as a concept which exists, right, a severe personality disorder, when we look at someone who might have a psychopathic personality, we might look at the behaviors, but what we specifically are interested in are the emotional and interpersonal characteristics that they exhibit. So the shallow emotions, the lack of empathy, the callousness, the lack of guilt and tendency to manipulate, and pathological lying, these kinds of things. Does it make sense? And some of the myths associated with that, I mean, psychopaths are not all violent. Many psychopaths are not violent at all. They often will be very good at manipulation and deceits. Psychopaths have no emotion. That's another bit of a myth. They often can display a spectrum of emotions, right? They can show crying and upset and so on and so forth, but they typically have, like, the thing about their emotional experience is that it's quite shallow, right? So it doesn't go very deep, and there's a lack of empathy. And they also have a key characteristics in that they're very, very self-centered. They're very egocentric, right? And obviously, another myth is that psychopaths can't be treated. There's dispute about this. I think that there's some, obviously the Bernstein study that showed that forensic chemotherapy was effective in working with high-risk violent offenders who were in many cases quite psychopathic, so it reduced their level of violence. It doesn't get rid of psychopathy, but it certainly does change their risk, which is what we want. So there is evidence to say that certain kinds of treatments with psychopathic individuals can help them. But again, we can't cure psychopathy. You can't cure, in many cases, low empathy and that type of thing. And when I work with psychopathic clients, I'm not trying to make them good people, in the sense that I'm trying to make them sort of loving and kind and compassionate, because in many cases that's just not possible. I'm trying to help them become better at managing the sides of themselves that get themselves into trouble, so that they can live a life, whatever they in the community, without causing problems and hurt in the way that they might have done. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense that we don't want to make from our patients like a model of the mental health, because it's impossible. And I understand that they, like a psychopath, they have like lack of skills in general of like feeling the deep emotions. They cannot be empathic so much. Yeah, and I heard that they also have a kind of more like the cognitive, more like that they understand how and why people can like showing some emotions, and that this is more like the they call it the cognitive emotions, like that. Have you heard about it?
Yeah. So they'll usually, I think it's the terms it's the hot empathy where you can feel it, right? You have this experience where you can empathize with someone and feel the emotional experience, or roundabout the emotional experiences of what someone might feel, right? Most of us therapists, or certainly therapists, should have it in buckets, right? We have a lot of feelings about when someone talks about a difficult experience. Psychopathic clients will be good at recognizing what the emotion, maybe labeling the emotion that person might feel. So cold empathy, or I don't know whether it's called cold empathy, I might get the term wrong, but they just don't feel it to the same degree. I'll give you an example, and this is, I actually had an example of of perhaps this. I was from this morning. I was seeing a client. Yeah, it's very fresh, and because it was so remarkable. Where so this is a fellow that I've been seeing for a little while. He's a psychopath. He's diagnosed psychopath, so he's very psychopathic, but he's very superficial, very charismatic, very charming. And he comes in. And he's telling me about, he's saying, look, Lars, I think, I could be a really good therapist. I could be a real good counselor. He says, well, I've got a lot of empathy, a lot of compassion. And, I really, can see what's going on for people and I can help them. I can sometimes, so we start this conversation and he's on an order for, quite a lot of violence and sexual violence and that kind of thing. So his whole life has been spent in institutions. But he's relatively young, very charismatic, kind of good looking. And he's telling me very convincingly that he's thinking, well, this is, I reckon I could be a good therapist. What do you think, Lars? He's kind of asking me. And it was a fascinating moment because it kind of captures a little bit of the psychopathic personality. So he is so engaged in this sort of manipulation, impression management of me that he's almost kind of like disconnected from a little bit of his own reality. So he's saying all the right things, like he's got all the buzzwords, empathy, compassion, conceptualizing, CBT, like he can know all the right words and he's saying it and he's going, yes, yeah. And he was saying that I've had these horrible experiences and I know what it's like when people have these horrible experiences in the homes and things like that. And then we did a little chair work, right? So I said, okay, I want to, that's all very, very well and good, John. We'll just call him John. I said, how we've talked about, and I said, look, we've talked about his conning manipulator mode. And I said, look, can we put your conning manipulator mode in the schema chair and have an interview with him in terms of how he's going? And of course he said, yeah, of course, love to. So we put him in the chair and then we just start talking. Right. So this is 5 minutes later after he's telling me he's going to be a great therapist and this is what he thinks he needs to go because he understands people. And then he starts telling me, he goes, yes, I am very good at being able to spot vulnerability in people. I know how to exploit it, and that's what I look for. He starts, and we just had a conversation 5 minutes ago, like about how empathic he is. And he goes, and he starts talking to me about how from a very, very young age, and we've kind of had these conversations before, so it's not completely new. So I knew, we'd labeled this a little bit, but it was in such a contrasting way this morning, where he then sort of talks that he then starts to regale experiences of himself being able to very consciously act like a chameleon for people that were caring for him, showing him empathy, that kind of thing, and to get information about them, to find out vulnerability that he could exploit at a later time. And he would describe incidences of being in homes where he had an elderly couple caring for him, but he figured out that they were having marital problems, and then he turned the tables on them, or one of them, at a time so that he could sort of exploit that information to get things that he wanted. All right. So he started to just talk about how this was all a facade of showing empathy and kindness, and how good he was at being able to spot vulnerability, and how a lot of the time these interactions with people when he was in this mode was actually about manipulation. It was ultimately about power, right? And power to be in control and to have things on people so that he could eventually, be back on top, be back on control. So
a bit narcissistic too.
Very, very grandiose, very narcissistic.
Yeah.
But this is the thing about psychopathic personalities, is that certainly in my experience, and I'm sure that this is, I've read, it's this sense of wanting to have power and be in control and not being able to accept limits. And simply wanting to be able to kind of figure out how to constantly get themselves back on top, and doing it in very devious ways. So we kind of eventually got him out of the chair and got the conning manipulator out. And then, we could talk a little bit about, well, what did he think about that? And he was like, yep, that's definitely me. And then you sort of go back to, but at the beginning of our session, you're sitting here telling me that you're going to be a great counselor, being so compassionate and empathic to other people. And he's like, yeah, well, that was bullshit.
You got me.
Yeah, that's bullshit. You know that. Yeah. So shallow affect, right? So boom, able to turn the tables on you all at once. So in a sense, that's kind of the nature of what you're dealing with when you're working with some of these kinds of personalities who present like this, is that they can be so controlled, they can be so focused on trying to control the process that you're in. And it's in many cases a very long process working with them. It's a very long process of getting to know them. It's a very long process of starting to be able to recognize the modes, and when they're in the room and being able to call it out. And you can see, I mean, it's a very psychopathic thing. Like if, for example, you or I get caught out, lying, I mean, we might feel bad, right? You might go, oh my God, I'm sorry, this is so embarrassing, right? But no, it just goes, boom, oh yeah, that was bullshit. Like, that was 30 minutes ago. We were just talking about this. You were just telling me 30 minutes ago you were wanting to become a counselor, to counsel people because you cared so much. And here we are, and it's like, it's bullshit. So,
it could be very difficult to differentiate the modes, because it could, for some people, they can name this mode as maybe it could be a part of your healthy adult mode, because yes, you want to heal others, but no, that this is the manipulator mode. So it's pretty challenging, I think, to differentiate those modes.
And that's one of the key things in terms of that really gets people, I think, and that is the vulnerability to be manipulated, and and almost be able to kind of because it's really, really hard to catch these modes, and you find yourself. I mean, there's two things that happen for you, and in this space. I mean, one is you want to have a healthy skepticism, but you also want to maintain your sense of warmth and your sense of humanity, and not see every client that you see, not any of your clients, as some kind of monster that can't be treated, is intractable, that kind of thing. So it's a fine balance where you can't see them as a victim, and you can't see them as a complete monster either. You have to kind of balance that in your mind, and that's I think it's not an easy thing at all. I certainly have had situations where I've been manipulated and gotten things wrong and misunderstood things and that kind of thing. I mean, I think that's probably a common experience. And I've also had situations, I think, where the danger is that where they become because they've had, in a lot of cases, extremely traumatic histories, extremely, unbelievable trauma, right? And awful experience, things you cannot even imagine. And you almost kind of fall guilty because you kind of want to hold them accountable for all this harm that they might cause. But then, like you can also see that the victimization that they've suffered as well. And so in a sense, you're almost holding these two things, where I need to hold you accountable for, hurting people and doing this and treating people like this. And I know the reason why you do that is perhaps because you've had all these horrible things happen to you, and that should never have happened. But, it's a tricky dynamic to have to juggle. And it's why therapy with severe personality disorder in a forensic context is often long-term, and it's very, very slow. And it's very much, you're very much working with modes.
I think,
Yeah. back and forth, like this session I'm telling you about today. So next week we'll have to unpack that, but next week I expect that he'll be more convincing and charismatic, and we'll have to deal with that because it changes so much.
And maybe this could be a good question: how often they react when you name the manipulator mode? That, oh, this is like, we can recognize this mode here. And how often they react like, oh, you invalidate me, that they react with anger, or they more like tend to like accept it, that, okay, yeah, you're right?
Yeah, look, it'll depend for different clients that I've worked with. What I have generally found in my experience is once you start working with someone and you have to go through their history of offending and their childhood, and you start to understand this, you start to use the language of sides and parts, right? So there's a side of you, there's a part of you, there's a part of you that wants to get revenge, there's a side of you that doesn't tolerate being vulnerable, there's a part of you that's constantly scanning the environment to work out what your threats are, to be able to eliminate them or get rid of them, right? That I think a lot of the forensic clients that I have understand this implicitly, and they find the language of parts and modes to almost be kind of a very different kind of conversation than they have often had anywhere else, right? So a lot of their previous experience with therapists or judges or social workers or context or family or even the media is that they're a monster, and it's the whole of them that's the monster, that they are untreatable, that they, so that's all the messaging they get a lot of the time. So when you start talking about the fact that, okay, I see that there's a part of you that doesn't want to be vulnerable because that feels scary. Okay, I get that. I get also there's a part of you that needs to keep yourself safe, that needs to sort of look out for who's dangerous and who's not. I get that. And I know that there's a part of you that when you feel threatened, you got to get on top, right? Because if you're not on top, then that feels terrifying, right? And I think that, so we can start to use this language, and clients will get it very quickly because it makes sense to them, of course, as well, because they suddenly start to go, I have to be violent. And in some cases it's true. Like, I mean, these people, these men, usually men that I work with, but I mean, it's the case as well for women within a forensic context. You learn violence almost becomes a way of keeping safe. Violence becomes a way of getting your needs met. Manipulation becomes a way of controlling the environment and staying safe. Being able to spot vulnerability in other people and exploit it becomes just another strategy for surviving a world that feels dangerous and overwhelming, right? These are deployable skills that you need to be able to survive, right? So it makes sense within the environments that they often come up from. So I think being able to understand, start to communicate it and formulate in that way makes the whole process of being able to start to call out the modes in session a lot easier as well. All right. And it makes it, for this fellow, for instance, that I was telling you about, it makes it easier to go, okay, so I know that, and he can go, yeah, all right. Because we've already had the story of saying, well, this manipulative, controlling mode came about when he was growing up in the homes and being abused. So he had to figure out how to do that very early on. So suddenly we can start to say, okay, so it feels like it's that kind of mode being here, so it works, I think, a lot. So it works in that kind of way. I think what I have, but in saying that, it hasn't always gone well, right? Like I've had moments where, for instance, I've, something has happened and I've needed to talk to a client about it. And, he's trying to convince me of, so for this instance, there was an incident in a public space where he was observed to have offended against some children. and this was being investigated, and I had to talk to him about it. And when I talked to him about it, he became very, very angry at me and very threatening. He's a big guy, and he stood up and was yelling at me, and they could hear it all the way through the clinic. Just this, angry protector mode, right? Big style. And in that moment, right, I had known this man for a very, very long time. He is a psychopath as well, but we had a rapport, a connection of sorts, right? And I was, it's frightening, and I don't know whether it went well or I handled it well, but I was able to put a limit on his angry protector mode, and sort of highlight that I know, right, that there's a part of him that also, wants to, be safe and to understand and to, not get in trouble. And the reason why I'm here talking to you is because I'm trying to help that part of you be able to live a life where you have freedom and choice. So in a sense, being able to do an empathic confrontation with him, I get how you feel. I'm sorry that you feel this way, but this is the reality. This is the situation we find ourselves in. And, he was able to kind of defuse a little bit. I have had situations. So these are some examples where it went maybe well, okay. I have had other situations where I've just had out and out threats and basically saying, well, if you don't do this, I will kill you. I will find a way to get you and I'll hurt you. And and that hasn't.
Isn't something that we should report? Or because it's like, should we report those kind of threats?
Yeah. So in a situation like that, there's a process for it. Like, obviously, it's only ever happened within an institution rather than within a regular clinical context. And I think, you of course have to report it. I have to report it. You report it. And and that's not comfortable, of course, to have death threats. And it's very, very rare, very rare, very rare, extremely rare. I mean, I can only count on, I think, less than one hand maybe of the number of times. I guess the thing that comforts me, if you can say that, is, I have some understanding of the credibility of it, so it's not very credible. So I don't believe that they would enact it. I think it would be different if I believed they could. So it's someone within an institution. And I also would know in many cases that, death threats are just part of their day-to-day thing. They always giving death threats out to people. And, so they lose track of who they've given death threats out to. And the thing with really combustible and challenging personalities is that also, it's not just you that they might end up having a grievance with or a preoccupation with, but it's everyone else in the environment. So you usually kind of get forgotten somewhere in the background. But that's fortunately very, very, very rare in my experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those very important your experiences from your work, and those because a lot of villains and I think also superheroes, they also have in their past so traumatic events. Like Superman, he was he was alone. He his closest family, they're gone. And the Batman, he also
Batman,
have
yes.
some so trauma.
Done your research, Adam. So yeah. So you're talking about the superhero, supervillain stuff that I've done. Yeah, look. Let me tell you a little bit about that. So the superhero, supervillain thing, it really emerged because like a lot of the time, I guess what I you always kind of try to figure out, well, how can I communicate and create stories that people can grasp and understand, right? That my clients get, and people go, oh yeah, I get that, I understand that. So you're always trying to, and schema therapy, I think, is complicated. It's complicated for people with bloody PhDs. It's complicated for people without. So, you've got to constantly try to, find a story or narrative that kind of makes sense and people can kind of get, because I think that the beauty with schema therapy is that it's actually quite simple once you get it, right? But getting it, I think, is the tricky bit. And, so the superheroes and supervillains is a concept that I've written a little bit about. I don't know, I've published some stuff on it. And it really... So it emerged because there's this parallel between, I think, those characters and my friends and clients. So when I grew up a little bit in Denmark, a little bit in Australia. I was immersed in reading comic books. I began to see, so I began to see how schema modes observed in therapy could actually mirror the characteristics of both heroes and supervillains in these stories. So when I started to delve a little bit deeper into this idea, it's kind of fascinating. The many comic book heroes, when you look at their backstories, right, are actually marked by severe trauma. So, for instance, Batman's narrative, who you mentioned before, is iconic, right? He witnessed the murder of his parents, and he grew up as an orphan in the cold, detached environment of Wayne Manor, with the butler there, Alfred, looking after him. Of course, he's very rigid, very self-contained English fellow. Batman's abilities, or arguably his superpowers, were forged directly from the trauma, right? And and his superpowers, when we look at them, actually represent overcompensating modes, right? And similarly, Spider-Man's origin story involves also profound loss and adversity as well. Very similar to Batman, he lost someone, and then that kind of that trauma sort of prompted him to take being Spider-Man, a superhero, seriously, right? But interestingly, when we look at both superheroes and supervillains, they actually share their traumatic background, yet their paths go in different directions. And this divergence, this different directions, is frequently due to the fact that one superheroes actually receive love, right? They experience some form of love and support, which shape their resiliency and moral compass, while supervillains lacked this. They didn't get that. So they...
That's a big difference.
There's a big difference. And when I look at my clients in the forensic space, I see a lot of them, they had a lot of trauma, and very few of them, got love in the way that we understand it, got their needs met. And hence, I can see a little bit about how this diverged on a different path. So I think that these kinds of stories, this kind of narrative provides, a valuable and easily graspable insight into the etiology of schema modes. And many of my clients, who have these massive overcompensating modes, grew up in environments like that was devoid of love and attention and nurturance and care. And, these modes, these overcompensating modes, are really their adaptations of having to cope with this lack of emotional support in their early childhood. And I think that when you look at the supervillains, it mirrors their trajectory as well. Yeah. So I find that that's superheroes, supervillains. Feel free to use a metaphor if you like, it makes sense.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's a great metaphor, and it shares a meaning. Yeah, and those big differences, because we can say that like they both got trauma, the supervillains and superheroes, but maybe this love that superheroes they experienced, so that's why they like choose to, still in the hyper compensative modes, but they want to help others. And the supervillains, they like more want to hurt others, but still, there's having a love. Yeah, so it makes a difference, and it makes all sense. Yeah, so it's great metaphor.
Yeah, it is. And the thing is, right, and this is what I love about it as well, because it obviously tells a schema mode story, but also the key in schema mode, in schema therapy, is, of course, reparenting, limited reparenting,
yeah.
which is love, right? It's limited love, right? You learn, you have to heal someone through this process of limited reparenting, limited love.
Maybe at the end, because I know that you have a limited time, and I don't want to take more your time. So maybe what are your recommendations for our listeners? Yeah, to maybe learn more about, on the one hand, your work, and where they can find superheroes and supervillains, metaphors and informations more. And the things that you could recommend to them to learn more about psychopaths and the treatment and the schema therapy in the forensic field.
Yeah, okay. So the forensic schema therapy world is actually quite limited, but David Bernstein and his colleagues, they published literature within the scientific literature that's available. As well, there's we have, I have an online training program called A Hero's Journey. So it's another storytelling kind of mode, which really tries to look at treating a forensic client with a violent history from the beginning, middle, and end. So it sort of is a 6-week training program that walks you through sort of an intervention and a deep analysis of a forensic client. It's called The Hero's Journey, and it's on Schema Therapy Online. I'm just got to be able to make sure that I say it right. Schema Therapy Online. So if you Google Hero's Journey, Forensic Schema Therapy sessions, that'll come up. And also, if you're interested in listening to more about forensic schema therapy, I have a podcast called Beyond the Crime. It's on all the major platforms as well. We try to release one episode once a month, and usually it's kind of focused around a particular type of issue that we have as 3 schema therapists talking about, trying to analyze what's going on. So, for instance, we might look at the issue of sex offending, and then look at the issue of violence, and then look at the issue of stalking kind of behavior, and try to kind of break it down from a perspective of, well, how do we make sense of this from a schema perspective? What are we thinking? How would we work with someone? What would that look like? And we share some of our experiences of these kinds of issues, and talk about, how do you do good schema therapy with tricky clients and trickier issues.
Right, thank you. You can send me some links, so I can post them into the description of our episode. It would be an honor. Thank you very much for being with me here and for sharing your knowledge, your experiences. It was a big honor and pleasure to talk with you. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. I really appreciate the invitation. I've really enjoyed my time chatting to you. Thank you very much.